Hello and welcome to Live from America podcast. I'm looking forward to this episode. We're going to discuss, the war, but from a different angle. And I'm really excited about this discussion. We will talk about the day after. How might a less awful future be promoted? We'll start first by, Israel, Hamas. Would that war be escalated regionally? And then we'll talk about different scenarios, how this could end. So it's going to be interesting. Noam Dworman is here, owner of the Comedy Cellar. Hello, sir.
Hi, we have to talk about only about the day after. We can't talk about what you
No,
guys are
just
doing
one day.
now.
No,
All
just
right.
one day. And you should follow Noam on
Yeah, by the
Twitter.
way, I'm sorry. Your audio is distorted. I don't know if it's just to me. You guys hear that?
Can you
Oh,
hear me?
okay. Yeah.
I hear you, but it's distorted. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yep. I was saying you should follow Noam on Twitter because he doesn't shy away. Noam underscore Dorman. And Lou Perez is here, comedian and author of That Joke Is Not Funny Anymore. Hello, Lou.
Hey guys.
Good to see you. And the return, our special guest is return of Natan Sachs. Dr. Natan Sachs is the director of the Brookings Institution Center for Middle East Policy in Washington, D.C. He published widely
That's
on the
enough.
U.S. policy towards the Middle East and Israel regional policy and Israel domestic politics.
More.
No, no, no.
That's he said that's enough. He's a big mocker in his Jewish.
He's very I love his opinion.
He's
And
an important voice, and I'll tell him that quite
Thank you.
often. I get emails of people who read his stuff,
Thank
and
you.
they send it to me, and it's with the implication that he knows what he's talking about, and you're out to lunch, and I'm always reading. I'm like, I don't think he and I actually disagree about that much. But you're very highly respected
Thank
by
you.
the type of people who read who write for the Atlantic and stuff like that.
I'll
These
say what I said the last time I was on. I'm
yeah.
easily the least funny person on the Zoom call, and since this is the least funny time I remember,
Yeah.
it's appropriate.
yeah, no,
I
you're
like
right.
I
Yeah.
like a challenge. Uh,
So let's start. But first, did you want to talk about something right now, Norm?
Well, um, I haven't watched it, but I am interested in this thing going on at The Hague with South Africa accusing Israel of genocide, and I'd be interested to know what Natan thinks about that, since it's the number one issue right now.
Go ahead.
Look, I think
Did you get to watch it?
I didn't watch most of it, no, but I read transcripts of a lot of it. Which is kind of what I try to do these days to save my sanity. Um, Look, I think we have a general devaluing of what words mean. Something can be awful, horrendous. It can even, in theory, be a crime against humanity. It can be many things, even if it's not genocide. And this, to my mind, is clearly not genocide. Still could be awful. Still could be terrible. It could even be a crime against humanity. I don't think it is, but it could be. Genocide is something else. Genocide is trying to kill a whole people. I hate to put it in such gruesome terms. If Israel were trying to do that, it would look much worse, even, by far, even than what it is. And of course, it looks terrible already, or is terrible. It's not, doesn't mean it's genocide. It's a different thing. I'm not an international lawyer, and blissfully so. So I don't have much to say on the legal proceedings, but I think genocide means something very specific. It's not just the Holocaust. There was a genocide in Rwanda, but there was an attempt to eradicate a group, to eradicate it, not to do terrible things to it, but to extinguish it. That's what genocide means. It means the murder of a people. This is just not that. So again, still can be terrible. It doesn't diminish anything. But I think words shouldn't matter in that sense. I think, this is mostly political. It's not really legal. This is really mostly about the politics. And then I understand people being outraged and trying to stop this in any means possible. I think there are other ways to stop it, but that's what it might take. But again, take it with a grain of salt. I'm not a legal expert, and again, I don't actually think this is about legality. I think this is about the political spectacle and putting Israel on trial and all that. And I get the motivation to do that. I don't agree, but I get it.
Yeah. I had a thought. and I want to do more research about this because I think it's actually important. Um, but so let me just start. Well, let me just start with a hypothetical. If the Lord came down and gathered all this Gazan civilians and deposited them in a remote part of Gaza that has absolutely no strategic importance to Israel, it's just, an oasis there for their safety, what would happen? In my mind, Israel would be relieved. They'd thank God for taking all these civilians out of there and removing this problem from this nettlesome problem, and they can now go whole hog. And Hamas would immediately try to figure out ways to suck these people back into their web, relocating their weapons, find one way or another to bring them in, because the death of these civilians is their war aim. And if you look at it that way, and if we're going to get technical about the meaning of genocide, Hamas is the one committing genocide here. Hamas is committing genocide of Palestinians. And I have the definition of genocide here: among the different killing members of the group, causing serious bodily mental harm to members of the group. And C is deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now, you can go on and on and on and find quotations from Hamas leaders saying that this, as at times, this bloody arithmetic is precisely their cause here. Just like one example, Hamas political bureau Ismail Hania said, Hamas needs the blood of many Gazan civilians, women, children, and elderly, because it awakens within us the revolutionary spirit. They need it. This is their aim, is the blood of their own civilians. And I think it's very powerful and on very firm ground here to turn the tables on this argument and say, well, no, what you're doing here is you're normalizing human shields. That's what the whole world is doing here. You're turning the law, which was supposed to protect the victims, and using it as allowing the victimizers to use it as a weapon here. But the fact is, if we're going to get technical about the definition of genocide, I think there's a very compelling case here that Hamas is committing genocide on its own people. What do you got to say about that, Hatem? Or any of you?
Oh, I have a lot to say, but let's get Lou in.
No, it makes sense, no?
I'll say my opinion after Lou. Go ahead, Lou.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like Natan, I am not an international lawyer. I'm very far from it. I do agree that it is important that there are agreed upon definitions. And I wonder, I mean, just from like a historical standpoint, have there been, like, for example, I obviously the Holocaust, I know of the Armenian genocide, but yet
alleged Holocaust. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the alleged Holocaust. 6 million, really, guys? Come on. But like, for example, the Armenian genocide is something that I don't necessarily know if the entire world agrees that was a genocide, in particular Turkey. So it's sort of, I do wonder, not only are we dealing with, definitions, but also what does it take to basically for the world to agree that something is a genocide, and then how do you act upon that? And while Noam is making a case, making his case, doubtful that is going to actually move a lot of people, I think, in the public opinion. So.
Well, I think it doesn't have to be a genocide for the world to act to it, obviously. But also I think that there's a lot of terms that need to be changed. I think this world and this war in general have changed a lot of things that we need to know. But also there are parts, and I don't think you guys will disagree with that there is parts in the Israeli government, and very right, that would love to get rid of everybody in Gaza. We know that.
Not genocide. They would like to move them out of Gaza, but that's quite different than genocide.
I think some of them really want to get rid of everybody.
I mean, murder them all?
I believe so. Yeah.
No,
there's some parts of the government that wants.
Has anybody ever said that?
I
there have
mean,
been statements. But I think the statements, but they've not been statements by the decision makers.
Statements to kill everybody in Gaza?
No, but to imply
No.
sort of Amalek, these people are like Amalek.
No.
So that's how the South Africans started their
And also the nuclear bomb thing.
Well,
yeah.
Wait, hold on.
There's been someone who proposed a nuclear bomb. There was someone who said they're, like Amalek, which in the
Yeah, but that was
Bible
Netanyahu who said Amalek.
Yes,
So,
but the question is,
and
he's Hatem though.
Well, but I just want to say, just because this is a particular, this really bothers me, this point, and I'm surprised that Natan buys into it, which making me rethink my own feelings about it. But let me just say, Netanyahu has referred to many of Israel's enemies historically as Amalek. He used it in that speech as kind of like fighting evil. Yeah. However, 2 paragraphs later in this speech, he points out, we're going to make sure to protect the civilians. So this is a propaganda point they make against him. And I think we should fight it to actually think that Netanyahu was signaling we're going to slaughter all the women and children. We shouldn't give an inch to that because it's just not true.
No, it wasn't referring to Netanyahu, to be fair.
But moreover, if Israel actually wanted, I'm sorry to be so gruesome, it does have nuclear weapons, right? If that were the intent, it would not try to bring the people out of the northern Gaza Strip, which brought so much condemnation for deporting people, etc. It wouldn't be doing that. It would be keeping them there, and if that were the goal.
And I think I think a lot of people were, again, with the definition of genocide. But when you look at like how many civilian casualties, yes, we know in wars, civilian casualty will die. But we have to get to a point when it's like, it's too much. Why wouldn't you, say, okay, that's genocidal, because if there is 2 million people, say, in Gaza, and like half of them will be gone, what is that? Of course, it's horrible in a lot of things, but I think a lot of things that people need to rethink. And especially just like Noam quoted Ismail Haniyeh, there's also some people like on the Israeli part that could say like some of stuff like that. I mean, we say like, I don't know if you saw the videos in TikTok of Palestinians, babies like a toy, like to kill, like, like there's so much that you feel that I see the case of that,
I don't. I mean, I see the case of it, but to me, there's a tell here. I'm sorry to accuse you of it, but there's a tell in everyone who makes this argument, which is that if you don't mention in that same presentation the fact that Hamas is doing everything it can to have their own people die, if you don't mention that they move their rockets to the very places that have been identified as safe zones, if you don't mention any of that, then I don't think your point is really simply about the civilians dying. It's a weapon against Israel, because the villain here, it's like Israel's driving legally to a permitted destination, and then somebody comes and starts throwing people in front of the car. And yes, you can tell you shouldn't be driving, you shouldn't be driving. And at some point, I guess you got to stop driving, and people are going to keep throwing people in front of your car. But Hamas is throwing people in front of the car, and to have a single-minded criticism of Israel here.
But that's not true. This is not what I'm doing. Besides,
what I'm saying, Hatem, Hamas could stop the civilian deaths like that. Just move these people away from where they're fighting from.
It's a simpler way. Hamas could leave.
Or Hamas could leave, but that's not similar.
In fact, Hamas could have ended the blockade.
We can also argue about Hamas and why it's there and who put it in power.
Okay,
and all that.
But we're going to talk. We'll talk about the day after. For the record,
I just want to make one point quickly before we go down. Is like, it's not just one villain. Like, it could be many. Of course, Hamas is accused of a lot of things. I mean, we have an international law lawyer here, and it said if Hamas have the people like human shield, like if they build their stuff in the hospitals or whatever, that's a human right violation against Hamas. So we know that, but that doesn't mean that just one side is okay. I think a lot of people have blood in their hands from all the sides. That's my point. And if we want to be fair, we have to look at it from the bigger angle, not just
but Israel has a right to win.
I think in all these conversations, like, there are so many variables there, and what we're pointing, what Noam and others are pointing out is the big variable is Hamas, so for example, say, tomorrow at the very least, Hamas had released all of the hostages, which Hatem, you and I have talked about. Many of them are Muslim hostages as well. If they had released the 100 hostages that they have, then that would be a point that they can make to say, like, hey, you're still attacking us, but we released these hostages.
I think Hamas have more hostages than that. They have 2 million hostages.
No, okay, no, but what I'm saying is, it's like it's at a point where even moves like that aren't being made, where people could turn around and say, like, hey, look, they released all these hostages, and yet you're still attacking. So it's I think that the Hamas is the big
Well, Hamas is, but
there.
also I think the retaliation for it is too much, and Hamas was put in power by a lot of people. But anyway, let's move on to my first question. So, do you think, Natan, do you think the the Israel-Hamas war is going to escalate regionally, like bigger than it is right now? I remember something that it just came back to my mind in my childhood. I remember the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein used to have that trick. He's like, I'm going to send missiles in Israel, so Israel will hit me back, so the Arab world will protect me. I remember that when I was a kid, and everybody was saying, like, calm down, nobody jumped in, because that's exactly what he wants. And back then, the Arabic world was pretty hot. They could have done it, but thankfully it didn't happen. I don't think it's going to happen this time. What do you think?
I think it's very close. And it's very close because so I think in the Gulf War, I remember that very well. I was in the bomb shelter, and it was a big thing. No, it wasn't great. But I remember the dilemma for Israel then was very big, because there's kind of how civilians in Israel are being targeted with Scud missiles. Israel's not retaliating, and the United States was pressuring Israel very strongly. Like, we're fighting a war against Saddam. Just shut up. Just sit there. And eventually Israel did in that case. I think it was definitely the wise choice. Here, from the very beginning, there was a risk of escalation, because probably Hamas's calculation was they get into a big war with Israel and it draws Hezbollah in. The Second Lebanon War in 2006 started with fighting actually in Gaza. They kidnapped then Gilad Shalit. Then there was the big exchange years later. He was the hostage then. And they infiltrated Israel with a tunnel, kidnapped him, and then the Second Lebanon War starts while that's happening. So that was probably the image they had. Hezbollah opted not to do that. Why? Well, it opted to fight, and there is already a very active and bloody war between Israel and Hezbollah. We should be clear about that from the beginning. But it has been within a level where both sides sort of keep unwritten rules of escalation. We keep it so far, right, as we're speaking at least, not full-blown war like it was in 2006. That's partly probably because the United States, from the very beginning, and the U.S., the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for this. This is something that a lot of people don't understand. For the Biden administration, Gaza is, of course, a major priority. It's getting a lot of flack for that, but it's only one. It's been very, very focused on trying to prevent the escalation. And the war that we haven't seen so far, the fact that Lebanon is still a livable place, or parts of it, that has probably a lot to do with the decisions of the Biden administration and Biden himself, sending 2 aircraft carrier groups, threatening also, if Hezbollah or others, meaning probably Iran, come in, we will respond, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that, the lesson that Israel and Israelis learned on October 7th, regardless of world opinion, is they cannot allow an armed militia intent on conquering Israeli towns and massacring civilians to be deployed on the border waiting to do it. They basically lived with that in Hamas. It was the whole idea, sort of the strategy of Israel was, look, we don't want to overtake the Gaza Strip because of the price for Israel and for the Gazans, and therefore we'll find a way to live with Hamas. It also fit Netanyahu's agenda of weakening the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. That didn't hurt. But of course, if he could have made Hamas disappear, he would have. Any Israeli would. But while it was there, we'll live with it. That ended in October 7th. No Israeli would agree to Hamas having a statelet, a sort of sovereign little statelet there under blockade, but able to amass a whole brigade to invade Israel and massacre and rape, etc.
But do you think any other players will jump in?
The problem is that this is also what they say. This is also what they think about Hezbollah. Because Hezbollah has been saying this for years. And Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, has said the next war will be in the Galilee, and we will conquer the Galilee, meaning probably a village, a town, 15 towns in the Galilee. And the elite force of Hezbollah and other fighters of Hezbollah are deployed along the Israeli border, contrary to the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 at the end of the 2006 war. And so the Israeli position has been, and they're dead serious, is Hezbollah cannot be deployed there because the Israeli civilians are evacuated. There are hundreds of thousands of Israeli civilians evacuated from the Gaza Strip border and from the northern border. They're in hotels and homes in central Israel now. And Israel says they will not return if the Hezbollah people are meters sometimes away from them. And therefore, either Hezbollah is convinced to adhere to Resolution 1701 or we will kick them out. And so that, now, right or wrong, the risk there is huge. And we've now seen assassinations probably by Israel of not just Hamas people in Lebanon, but also of commanders in the Hezbollah forces. We've seen a Hezbollah attack on a very strategic Israeli Air Force base, a radar and control command center on the height of the Galilee, highest point in the Galilee. And we're really on the precipice. And it's not, my point of this long rant is that it's not that there's a tit for tat and someone will go crazy. It's that there may be a mistake on one side and someone will go crazy. But second, there's an actual strategic logic here. Hezbollah wants to keep the situation where they're deployed along the Israeli border. Israel believes it cannot live with that. So you have a real problem. And therefore, I would not rule it out. I didn't even mention the Houthis. I've been talking too long. I didn't even mention the Houthis. That's another major issue. But
any other countries like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, anything like that? Iran? No.
I don't think so. And look, first of all, Egypt, certainly, but also Jordan and others, among the population, I don't need to tell you, you can tell us, but huge sympathy for the Palestinians, obviously. But among the regimes, also sympathy for the Palestinians, but hatred for Hamas. They probably, I'm sure, we know, hope that Israel prevails over Hamas. They would then like secular Palestinian forces to have their way.
No,
but yes, right, I'll shut up.
So I have a few thoughts, and actually, Natan maybe can help fill this out for me. I'm doing another interview in a couple of days that I wanted to actually have this clear in my mind. I think it's important to set out, the game Risk, the game will go where you it's important to lay out for people because they really don't understand it, what the risk board looks like now for Israel. There's 150,000 to 200,000 rockets aimed at Israel in the north. 30-40% of them are precision guided, correct? You have, go ahead.
We don't know exactly how many are precision guided, but some of them are. But it's a huge number of rockets. Hezbollah is much stronger than Hamas.
Okay.
That's
so you have that in the north. You put those on the border in the north. Then in the southwest, you have Hamas. We've seen what Hamas can do, and is constantly fed by Iran. Then in the east, whatever it is, you have the Houthis, who are now emerging as a force. And then also in that same vicinity, you have Iran, which is enriching uranium and preaching, fireballs and all this stuff. And what is Israel supposed to do? And in my mind, I say, well, okay, was America more or less threatened by the Japanese or the Germans than Israel is threatened today in terms of the cliche existential threat? I think Israel is much more existentially threatened than America has ever been in its entire life. If all those people that I referred to, all those entities I referred to, decided, okay, on this day at this time, we're all going to simultaneously put our forces forward, what could happen? I mean,
well, that's what Israel thought might happen just after October 7th. And on October 11th, they thought the reports are that on October 11th, they were considering a major preemptive strike in the north against Hezbollah. And the U.S. probably dissuaded them from that. So I think you're right about describing the threat, and it's huge, and Hezbollah is the biggest one by far. But that, that doesn't mean, it sometimes means you have to use force. I think in the case of Hamas, there was no choice. In the case of Hezbollah, there is no choice unless you can find a diplomatic way to do it.
Well, let me tell you why
the U.S. is working heavily on that. There's like a U.S. White House administration right now trying to negotiate Hezbollah adherence to 1701. And I'm not optimistic about anything, but there is a chance. There's at least a path. There's an avenue. There is a resolution. There are agents that can pressure Hezbollah. There's a chance that that could work
I
without.
want to tell you why I think you're wrong, but I know my argument will not win the day. If we were to transplant in various times in history, including the run up to World War II, but just in since Obama with Iran and all of it, every kicking of the can down the road to avoid war has been a mistake. If we had taken if the Hawks had their way in 2008 and 2012 at any particular time, I mean, they could have never proven what they prevented, but they would have wiped this threat off the table for a time. And if they don't take care of it now, what's it going to be 10 years from now? Enrich, you want to tell me that it's not a good likelihood that the next round of rockets won't have enriched uranium on their tips? They have to get rid of this threat.
Yeah, but the question is the reverse. Let's say you act militarily, and I'm not, in the case of Hamas, I'm for it. But the question is, A, the chances of success and what it would look like the day after. So you're saying, I think that the status quo or the slide we're on will lead towards something terrible. Yeah, high chances. The question is, let's say you strike in Iran, what will that lead to? And it's not at all clear it won't lead to something worse, including a nuclear Iran. And so, it's true that the threats are enormous. That does not, and that sometimes means you have to act militarily. I'm not opposed to it in all circumstances, but it does not follow immediately that you have to strike. It means that you have to think very carefully about where and what. And by the way, there is an argument, and it's not absurd, although I don't subscribe to it, but it's not absurd, that look, all of this, a lot of this, and a lot of what's happening elsewhere too, in Iraq and in Syria to a degree, and in Yemen, has to do with Iranian proxy, right? It's a non-Arab big country operating in the Arab world, targeting Israel, but not only Israel. And that's who you should go after, not the proxies. And maybe there is a logic at least to that. But I just want to say, the fact that not using force leads to terrible things doesn't mean that using force will solve it.
No, do you agree that that in the past when they didn't use force, particularly against Iran? I mean, there was a time when getting rid of Iran's nuclear program would have China was an ascendant, Russia was like there was,
but it wouldn't get rid. It was always just postponed. You could have shut it down, and then they would have probably gone towards nuclear weapons for real, not for threshold, which is already super dangerous.
Maybe. Yes,
I agree. Yeah. We don't know.
But that's what I say that there was this dynamic where, and this is again reminds me of World War I and World War II, that we were so spooked and fatigued and had so much PTSD from the Iraq War that we just didn't have the nerve to take care of Iran when America was still had full latitude to do it. And there was really nobody in the world that would have lifted a finger to stop it. I'll read one paragraph, then I'll shut up for this thing. Because I've been reading Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, and I'm reading his chapter about the run up to World War II. And there's so many insights that he has there, which remind me of the dilemmas that we're facing now. And I'll just read one here. Statesmen always face the dilemma that when their scope for action is greatest, they have a minimum of knowledge. By the time they have garnered sufficient knowledge, the scope for decisive action is likely to have vanished. In the 1930s, British leaders were too unsure about Hitler's objectives, and French leaders too unsure about themselves to act on the basis of assessments which they could not prove. The tuition fee for learning about Hitler's true nature was tens of millions of graves. This is the dilemma, is that and there's other things in there, like you got to act. The tuition fee for not acting is huge. The fee for acting hastily it may be significant, but it's not all the marbles. Israel's playing for all the marbles, and it may be too late now. Like, it may be too late for Israel to take the kind of actions that I'm talking about. Israel may be in really, horrible trouble. It scares me.
So I have a few questions and one comment. Well, one thing that I remember during the Trump presidency, when the U.S. assassinated General Soleimani, that one of the criticisms, and I guess one of the fears from a lot of people, is that this was going to be World War III, like this was going to start it. And thankfully that wasn't the case. But with that, I have a question about the the fear of Iran as a military force, because it seems like most of the fighting that they've been doing has been through these like proxy, these proxy factions. And then I have a question about the probability or of them possibly ever using a nuclear weapon in the region, because maybe it's Iran in the region. Because when I think about like it seems like the Mideast is so small, like that dropping a nuke would have just terrible effects for a lot of neighbors beyond just the target.
I think those are small ones now.
The small,
yeah.
Well, what about a dirty bomb? Is
yeah. But just there's one thing I want to add to this.
And, Hatem, can I just say one thing? And then just war in general, from from the standpoint as an American, at that time, during the Trump presidency, when World War III seemed on quite possible, we'd also been through 20 years of an ongoing war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, undeclared war, constant war, where I think there was a natural exhaustion from being at war for that long, and then also turning around and seeing like, man, had we actually made this region even worse than what it was before. So that's my comments.
I just want to add also that there was one thing maybe, Noam, you're not calculating is the love of power of the people at Hezbollah and Iran. They want to stay in power. So I think calculation, sometimes they will be like, we don't want to go too far, because they know they're gonna, they might lose their seats. Go ahead, Natan. Yeah, thoughts on that?
I'll try. I don't have, answer to that. My thoughts, I mean, first, Noam, I agree very much. I think that you have to be very, very wary of avoiding a problem that's only going to get worse. The only caution, and it may not apply to Iran, the only caution is that if you take that too far, you'll see doom in every corner, and you'll fight every fight, because every fight has the potential to be terrible, which is actually kind of true. And so it's always a matter of calculating risks and thinking, is it inevitable that this is a Hitler style? So I'm not saying Hitler is irrelevant to history, but we do also risk the risk of overlearning that. And Iran is a fighting power. Iran has mastered the fighting to the last Lebanese, fighting to the last Iraqi, fighting to the last everyone else. They did have a major, extremely bloody war with Iraq that Iraq started in 1980 and until 88. And that was enormously bloody. I mean, orders of magnitude worse than what we're seeing even now in Gaza by far. But since then, they've always tried to operate through others. And they believe in exporting the Islamic Revolution, their version of an Islamic Revolution. And Hezbollah is the most successful aspect of that. Houthis to a certain degree, and others. So would they, if they were actually fighting themselves, look, they're no match for the United States. They're probably no match for Israel either. They're also quite far from Israel. So it's not, it would be a missile fight and an Air Force fight, but it's a complicated, even for the Air Force, the Israeli Air Force, to get to Iran, not a simple thing. It's a lot of training. You need refueling. It's not so simple. So they could fight. They would not, their ballistic missiles would be a major issue. But it's not like the United States or even Israel is thinking if there were a war with Iran, then the Iranians are literally going to march into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. That's not the fear. The fear is more that they will ignite everything else. Sorry,
if we go back before October 7th, when there is like normalization between Saudi Arabia going that way and Dubai going that, like, I mean, the UAE, they're going that way and all that. Do you feel like if that didn't, I mean, one of the reasons I think that happened was because there's, that the Palestinian, nobody was, they seen the normalization going without them being part of a talk. So I think that went, but I think it could go in a good way with the negotiation and, the normalization. I mean, Saudi Arabia said that today that, they're not going to continue the talks unless there is a solution to the state, so.
So look, I think that, I mean, so the Abraham Accords, they sort of bypassed the Palestinian issue with the major exception of postponing Israeli annexation of parts of the West Bank. But by and large, they were a bypass around the Palestinian issue. For the Israelis and Netanyahu himself, it was a major thing of saying, you see, the Palestinians no longer have a veto over Arab affairs, and it's in the interest of the Arab world to normalize with Israel because we're here to stay. And therefore, you see, I can bring peace for peace instead of land for peace, which was always the demand the left in Israel supported. And the Arab world, by the way, still now has normalized the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, certainly. Sudan is a different issue, not really, but those three countries.
Egypt.
Now, Egypt before, of course, Egypt, not just normalization, but full peace, signed in 79, but started before, with a major strategic move by Sadat, the president then, and then peace, but with two elements, right? So one element was the return of the Sinai to Egypt. So the full Egyptian demand for complete Egyptian sovereignty over every inch of Egyptian land. And they did not want one grain of sand of Palestine. So Gaza, which they ruled before 67, they did not take back. They said that has to remain for Palestinian issue. But the Camp David Accords back in 78 included also a whole chapter on the Palestinian issue, which never really came to fruition. But many, certainly in the Arab world and certainly among Palestinians, saw that as a major betrayal by Egypt and by Sadat. The Arab League left Cairo. Sadat was reviled, eventually assassinated, maybe not only because of this, but also because of this. So a major, also a sense of betrayal. Jordan, of course, has peace with Israel that followed the Oslo Accords with the Palestinians. The big question that Washington, we were all here in Washington dealing, especially those who do Middle East, we're all talking about Saudi-Israeli normalization, which would have included a huge U.S.-Saudi deal as well, including potentially a defense pact between the two countries and a civilian nuclear program of the Saudis. And a big question that we were also dealing with at Brookings was, what could be a Palestinian component? Because to my mind, I'm very much in favor of the normalization, including the Abraham Accords. I also very much hoped that we could leverage this kind of normalization to improve things on the Israeli-Palestinian front, maybe in a big way. And because Saudi is the big prize, not even bigger than the UAE, there was potential to really get something, at least from a very, very low starting point. So not a state, obviously, but with some. Now it's changed. I personally, and I say this with some confidence, I think it's still on the agenda. It's definitely the way the Israelis, the Americans, and I think the Saudis think. It can't happen now. It can't happen during the war, and it probably has to wait for politics in Israel to settle and maybe politics in the US to settle. But the strategic sort of decision of MBS that he wants to have this pact with America and normalize with Israel, I don't think that has fundamentally changed. He certainly has no love lost for Hamas or any Muslim Brotherhood organization. And I think potentially in an ideal world, which we're not in, you could leverage that instead of for some changes in the West Bank to a major change in the Gaza Strip, because we have a huge question of what the day after looks like. And that it's not that Saudi Arabia is going to come over and take over the Gaza Strip. Far from it. They have no interest in doing so, and they couldn't do it. But if they could be the patrons of things that happens where secular Palestinians come in, I think the Palestinian Authority would need to come in at some point. They would have the cachet. They would have the funds that would be enormous and needed. In an ideal scenario, if all this were orchestrated and Israel were playing ball with the real political horizon that allowed the Saudis to do this in their own public opinion, then you could have a recipe for something better. We're very far from that. We're far from Israel being there. That could change this year, but still not quite there. Of course, there's the war, a lot happening. But all this to say, I think there's some potential. You asked, do I think this is what caused Hamas to do it? I imagine that's part of the scenario. But I also think they were probably preparing for this for many years and hoping to do it whenever they could. I'm also quite convinced not all of them necessarily knew what was going on and necessarily had the same kind of idea behind it. So what the inner workings in Hamas are also a big question. But the fact that they were preparing for this, building the arms for it, digging the tunnels, all this for years, long before normalization, that's obvious, I think. They probably did it also with that in mind.
How do you
so
think?
wait, can I? Yeah. So I think that you're right about Saudi Arabia. I'm always, some things I'm very confident talking about. This kind of stuff, I'm keenly aware that I don't know that much about it, and definitely don't know that much about military things. But my gut is that nations do things because it's in their interest to do so. Saudi Arabia would only consider normalizing relationships with the Jewish state if it very much felt it was in their interest to do so. And I would imagine that seeing the havoc that Hamas has been able to cause, Saudi Arabia might think it's even more in their interest to have a deal with Israel than less. That this kind of instability that these minor players can bring the world, to the brink of World War III would make Saudi Arabia want to take measures to stabilize these situations. And Iran seems like more of a threat than ever when its proxy is able to do this and is willing to do it, right? Is willing to do it. I want to say two other little Kissinger quotes here because I really think they're interesting. One is that, I won't read the whole of them. He says, the Democratic statesmen of the interwar period feared war more than they feared a weakening of the balance of power. That's something that seems to apply here. And then this concerns me more, and this one I asked Natan about. It says, he's talking about European powers. It says, by conceding that the Versailles settlement was iniquitous, the victors eroded the psychological basis for defending it. In other words, when they began to feel that the Treaty of Versailles actually was unfair and oppressive to Germany, they lost their nerve to take harsh measures to Germany. And one thing that scares me, and this is in Israel and then in the world, in the Biden administration, everywhere, is somehow this cancer of thinking that Israel is 3/4 of a legitimate state, but it somehow doesn't have clean hands, is infecting psychologically the decisions to defend it. That the world has reset its attention from 67, which used to be what everybody brought up, to 1948. All you hear now is about the Nakba in 1948, as if Israel doesn't really have a right to exist. And what that backs into in my mind is, well, it's all right if it exists, if it keeps its nose clean, but we're not going to allow it to, it's not going to be able to defend its right to exist by killing tens of thousands of people. Well, we'll live with it if it doesn't exercise all the rights of self-defense that a regular nation would, but we're not going to treat it as a regular nation that can defend itself the way the United States might have against Japan and Germany. All this scares me. I think that is the psychological subtext of a lot of people here. And that's why I brought it up at the top there. Well, if Israel is more threatened than we ever were, then who are we to judge Israel taking much weaker actions than we ever did?
Well, I think, I don't think it's, again, fair to compare, because, we have more technology, we have more intelligence, we have more. So the number of civilians dying, I think it's too much for anything. But I want to move on because that we have.
Let Natan answer that because he was about to answer what I said.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I do think that, 2 points quickly. One, for the sake of retaliating, I personally don't think you have the right to kill one civilian. The question is whether Israel's going after a legitimate, even if you think about proportionality in war, and again, I'm not a legal scholar, but I'm pretty sure about this because I've asked legal scholars. Proportionality in war is not how many died on one side or on the other. It's the proportion between the legitimate military target in the conduct of war itself, not the question of going to war, but in the conduct. So just in bellum, the value of a military target versus the damage that would be done and the civilian death.
Right.
That's the value. So the question is not how many civilians can Israel kill, as if because October 7th was so bad, now Israel is allowed to kill more civilians. That's nonsense. Civilians might die in a legal war if the target is legitimate one and makes sense. And so if you're asking not from a legal point, which I'm not an expert on, but from a moral point, if Israel goes after this, the question is it doing it for retribution or is it doing it to remove the next October 7th, which of course Hamas is going to do if it can.
But here, go ahead.
Sorry. So if you're there to remove Hamas, then that's one thing or something. I'm not trying to judge one or the other. I'm just saying I think that's the question. It's not is it doing more than anyone else? Is it removing the concrete military threat? In other words, prevention, not punishment.
But here's my point: is did you have to do it like that?
That's the valid question. Because that's the good question.
Yeah, because okay, Hamas is cornered now. You're safe. You have your troops.
No.
They're not gonna come in. You could have done a better strategy where you could have less civilians. That's my point. So two things I want to ask before.
But I think that is the right question, right?
Yeah.
Is there another way? Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I do think that's the real question. But the second point I want to make is about I don't remember.
Well, Natan, it is, of course, it's the right question. Of course, you're right. You can't just kill. It's not a tit for tat. Tit for tat is not moral. It has to. The point of proportionality is that your objective has to be necessary, and this notion that they could have done it with less death. I've had it up to here with this because we're 2 months, 3 months into this war. Let somebody tell us how they could have done it, and enough with this fantasy that they could have done it differently. I'm all for it if they could have done it differently, but not now. Go sit down. But I have to say that what you don't hear is these conversations vis-a-vis people in Ukraine and Russia. There's 100,000 civilians and people die. I mean, Hamas doesn't separate out civilians from fighters. So if we do that in Ukraine, it's more than 100,000 people killed in Hamas. My sons are not behaving. Go outside and tell them, not now until I finish. Sorry.
Stars of the show so far.
Let me ask you this before.
So more than 100,000 people died in Ukraine. I don't know. And people are not focusing on the civilian, on the death aspect of it. There is, for some reason, now I'm all for focusing on the death aspect of it. These conversations are very dangerous because it's very easy for somebody to take them and misconstrue you. I am haunted and I of course want Israel to kill nobody if they can. I only call upon people to tell us how, but I still can't help noticing that where is this hyper concern for the death in the Ukraine-Russia conflict? Many of the people who talk about Israel all the time, like Aaron Mate, Glenn Greenwald, all these people, they talk about the Russia-Ukraine thing as if it's from the history books. They don't really ever mention the civilian deaths or any deaths. And in Russia and in the Israel conflict, all they talk about is the deaths. And I'm wondering, what does that tell us about where they're coming from? Is it really about the deaths? Is it really about the deaths, or is there something about Israel that gets under their skin?
Well, I don't care about their agenda. I'm talking about myself and people that think like me. I think
you're, as I've said, you're in a different situation because you're a human being and you're Arab. So of course, this is unbearable for you. I understand that
it's unbearable, but I think the question of unbearable is real. The question of, well, anyway.
No, I agree with that. I'm not. So that's why it's very complex. I'm not really attributing that to you because it's the most natural thing in the world for you to look at these people dying, and for me actually, and see this differently than I see the Ukraine-Russia war because I'm connected to this conflict. I'm not connected to Russia and Ukraine, but there's a whole group of other people out there who claim to have no particular emotional tie to this conflict. I'm just calling it like I see it. I'm just being objective here. No, but they're not just being objective.
So many people are making living out of this, making fame out of this, making business out of this. We know that, So, Lou, let's two things before we say talk about this.
We're going to talk about comedy next. Is that what we're going to do? No, okay.
So this is from New York Times. How do you think this is going to end? So this is 10 scenarios that they thought. I don't know if you guys saw this article that, which one that you think, or if you have your own opinion, each one of you, we can go with this. Empowering Palestinians, let NATO nations send troops, create an economic future, the answer lies with Biden, international trusteeship, grant Gaza statehood, consider leading the role of the United Nations, two-state solution, build a culture of peace, let Palestinians decide.
So yeah, so
Or
Hatem,
any other, or others.
well, when I see let NATO nations send troops against which side?
Like in the middle.
I'm not sure. Like, the people who would call for that, are they calling for it to NATO to be fighting Israel, or NATO to be, fighting against
Peacekeeping.
Hamas? But
Hamas.
I think with all this, the it's important to have a realistic a conversation about what the realistic ends are, because for example, a lot of the people taking to the streets and shutting down traffic in New York City, a lot of the people even that I think Noam cited, they want the end of Israel, as they want Israel to no longer be there. And I just hung out with two friends of mine who came back to New York from Israel, and they went back and they've been living there. The Israelis aren't going anywhere. The Israelis are fighting for their existence, and that's just the fact. Like, there's not going to be a world where Israel doesn't exist. So it's like, being able to have these conversations. It's like if the goal of Hamas is the eradication of Israel, it's just not going to happen.
But we're not talking about this. We're talking about how that we can have peace in Gaza. It's not about what Hamas thinks. It's not about what how would this end so the civilians in both countries.
My apologies for not doing this segment, Greg, but it's something that I wanted to get out, because a lot of the conversations that I just hear, it's just very unrealistic. That I think a lot of the goals that activists have that aren't necessarily, I mean, Natan could speak to this about, what's really happening behind the scenes, and what, people in positions of power actually want, and what they can possibly get.
I think if you talk to people that actually involved in the situation, they understand, but anybody who just doesn't get it, they will just go with the flow, what TikTok tells them.
Can you unshare that screen?
Sure. Do you have thoughts, Noam, on how this will, or Lou, sorry.
Well, in the last few months, I did a very, very deep dive into the peace process. I read every book that's ever been, every word that's been written on it, including from Nabil Amr on the Arabic side, and my feeling is that the Palestinians don't want peace, and that if there was a chance, they might have accepted it because they have no other choice. Then it's absolutely essential that Hamas be absolutely defeated here, because if the psychology smells that, oh, we're winning this long game, and that 10 years from now we'll be in a better position, why would we settle for our 22% now, when 25 years from now it could be much more? Having said that, if Israel hopes to change that psychology, they have to, it might be futile, but they ought to, I guess, take every step that they can to cause goodwill with Palestinian people, because at some point in the end, if the Palestinian people feel better about Jews in Israel, then at some point that will lead to peace, right? So I think they should get rid of the settlements. I think they should, there's all sorts of things that they should do to try to do the right thing by these people who are under their boot, who are dangerous. And it's not a simple thing, but they should do everything they can to do the right thing by these people. So then in the long term, hopefully that will lay the groundwork for some psychological shift, which will then allow some future Palestinian leader to take the bold steps to make peace like Sadat did. But I'm very pessimistic about it, and I don't know. I don't know what Natan feels about it.
Natan, what do you think? And I remember interview that you said maybe 4 or 5 years ago, or is sometimes no solution is the best. Do you remember that interview? It was one of my favorite interviews for you. So what do you think? Sometimes no solution is the best solution, but what do you think? How is this going to end, or how could it end?
Look, I think I think we should be very, very realistic about where things are right now. Israelis before October 7th were extremely wary and afraid of what happens if Palestinians get more power and especially more territory from which to build their next strike, etc. And the Israeli fear. And Palestinians, for at least 70 years, have been
I'm
terrified.
sorry, do you mean Palestinians or Hamas? I just want to understand. Are they afraid of
Palestinians.
Palestinians in
Certainly
general?
Hamas, but in the broad public sense, also Palestinians writ
Okay.
large. That Hamas, but in the Second Intifada, it might be the Palestinian Authority and the Fatah groups,
Okay.
and Hamas might be something else one day. So a generalized kind of fear, certainly from Hamas. Hamas is the tip of the spear. And Palestinians have been sure and terrified for decades, at least 70 years, that in some future war, Israel will again kick out huge populations, so much so that in the northern Gaza Strip now, Israelis thought they were just telling Palestinians get out of harm's way. Palestinians were sure that Israel is now creating a new refugee problem because that's the fundamental menu of their fears with Israelis. And I think people who suggest one state solutions, or like Lou said, Israel's going to just disappear into some kind of secular future of Western, whatever, they misunderstand this fundamental base fear that animates the conflict because it creates what's known as an ethnic security dilemma, which is to say that if I see someone of the other side, and if I believe that there's even a reasonable chance that they are about to kill me or my family, etc., then suddenly I get an incentive to make sure that I win first. I beat them first. And because I have that incentive, they know it. And therefore they see me as a threat and they do exactly the same thing. And you get into an equilibrium, not a cycle. It's not a tit for tat. It's an equilibrium where we're all afraid of each other. And the real tragedy is that we're kind of right because we are trying to defeat each other because we're so afraid. Now that fear has been reconfirmed in such a massive historic way on October 7th and the months that followed. Israelis are now convinced beyond a doubt that if Palestinians are allowed a statelet in Gaza, the unthinkable would happen, like October 7th. And they are still living October 7th, Israelis. I can't emphasize this enough. And they look to the West Bank and they're terrified that would happen there, either with Hamas coming to power or someone else, and the North, as I said before. And Palestinians are looking at Gaza and saying, you see, not a second Nakba, but something historic, a generational trauma that, again, they're not going to forget, and that will breed radicalization there and also elsewhere. So I think we need to be super realistic about where we are. But the danger is that realism about, can we achieve some grand design that someone in Brooklyn wrote on a piece of paper? We're not going to do that. But what we can do, what we must not do is therefore assume, well, we can't do anything right now. We'll continue in the path that we were before. More settlements, more de facto annexation of the West Bank into Israel, a blockade on Gaza, which is a statelet preparing to do on October 7th with its government being Hamas, et cetera, et cetera. You have to be both realistic and say, we're going to have to talk about conflict management for a long time. Resolution and reconciliation are not in the cards right now. I say this with immense personal tragedy. But that is not the same as saying what was before has to continue. You have to have a complete mind shift. And the mind shift needs to be conflict management, but with an eye towards conflict resolution, which to my mind, at the end of the day, looks something like Palestinian independence. I hate to say two-state solution because it's a dirty word now, but it's something along those lines. It's probably going to look different than we said before. Probably have less Palestinian force involved because of the fear now on the Israeli side. But that has to be the goal. And in the meantime, you have to be serious about what conflict management can be, bringing out the elements of fear, settler violence in the West Bank against Palestinians, the blockade on Gaza that was created by the Hamas rule there, the Israeli-Egyptian blockade. All those things have to be, to the degree possible, eliminated. Security is still probably going to be in Israeli hands because they're terrified. They're not going to give it up anytime soon. But what I'm trying to say is peace, we define peace so grandiosely, big, capital P peace. We need to think about quiet and small p peace. In Cyprus, there's no peace agreement. It's half of it is still occupied. It's a disaster. You know how many people died from the conflict in Cyprus last year? 0.0. So give me Cyprus any day. I'll take Cyprus. That's my goal right now. And that may sound kind of cynical or not enough. To my mind, Cyprus would be heaven right now compared to where we are.
So you're not for a two-state solution?
I'm very much for a two-state solution.
Okay.
I think that should be the goal. But I also think we have to be super realistic about the chance of achieving it. And we make the mistake of saying two-state solution or bust. Because bust is not some, okay, well, wait, that's not what it is. Bust is horrific tragedy. And therefore, two-state solution absolutely, to my mind, needs to be the goal. Probably need a new name for it because it becomes such a bad name. But let's call it Palestinian independence alongside Israel. And that has to be the goal. We have to work towards it. Maybe it happens much faster than I think. I'm happy to be wrong. In any case, when we manage the conflict along the road towards there, we have to keep it, we have to get time working on our side. Beforehand, we were thinking we're managing the conflict. We weren't. The conflict was managing us. Time was working against everyone. It was creating a worse and worse condition. And that would take dramatic steps, including by the United States, some forceful language, some forceful arm twisting, including with Israel, by the way. It would not be easy to do. It's not, conflict management doesn't mean, well, tinkering. It doesn't. But it means also realistic about, do you achieve some grandiose heaven anytime soon? Because I see so many people, in the West, especially on October 6th, we're still advocating regime change, one state solution. Like Lou said, Israel, maybe it was all a mistake. It can go away. You had Peter Beinart on there. He's been advocating this for a long time. Well, maybe Israelis can be a minority. Jews can be a minority in the new.
So when I hear you say all this stuff, I think that of the various people I've met, I think I'd see eye to eye with you on a lot, even if I might say different things than what you're saying. We're kind of circling around the same kind of thoughts. But what it brings to mind is that, can Israel realistically accomplish any of the things that you're saying so long as Iran is pumping money and bad will into this conflict with impunity? And of course, Iran never wants any Palestinian independence state because Iran. So it does. If you're not going to be naive and idealistic, what you're saying really does focus pressure on Iran. Like
that's part of it for sure.
And what the hell are they going to do about Iran? And
I think Saudi Arabia will have a big part in that.
It's a difficult problem. I mean,
but I think Hatem raises an important point. Let's say Saudi move, if it happens, I don't know if it's happening.
Yeah,
that's an important calculation also vis-a-vis Iran. It's a major calculation for the Saudis.
Yeah, because they've been trying to have some relationship with the Saudi, and I'll add to that also the piece. A lot of things need to change from all the governments. The same players cannot be involved anymore. None of them. Not in the Israeli side, none.
But Hatem, it really does need to be said. I mean, it's such and a lot of things just don't get said enough. Like they don't talk about the human shields enough. If the Palestinian people wanted peace, they could have it. It needs to be said. They had no, go ahead, Natan. You want to stop me?
Great. I think we had this actually same conversation last time. Great. Maybe you're right. And maybe, by the way, maybe they are not willing to the kind of compromise that Israelis would ever be willing, or vice versa, right? Maybe the Palestinian image, peace really means undoing 48. It means a full right of return of all the descendants of refugees, and there would be no Israel. And Israelis' image is completely different. Maybe that's true. So we jump back to bust to
no. I agree with you.
We find peace that is much smaller than the grandiose thing. So it's not reconciliation. Okay, they never accept Zionism. Israelis never accept the Palestinian narrative. Great, they learn to hate each other with a clear border.
No, Natan, I agree with you. But at some point, when these conversations over and over, just when that kind of assumption just gets dropped from the conversation, you really do begin to think that you're having this conversation. Okay, if we would just do this, then we'll get the solution. When the fact is that the right thing to do is to do everything you're saying, because you have to be doing everything, your obligation morally and practically is to do everything you can do. Nevertheless, it's still, I think it's very important to bring out the fact that it's likely not to accomplish much until the Palestinians want the outcome. And then the second they actually did want the outcome, none of the stuff we're talking about would matter, because we saw this with Egypt.
Well, that's why I said all the players need to change, but also, you have
what could Israel have done to make peace with Egypt until the moment that Sadat woke up and said, you know what, I've had enough of this. I want peace with Israel.
I think it took a little bit more than that.
And if no Egyptian leader had ever had that change of heart, for the next 50, 75 years, Israel will be having these conversations. What if we tried this? What if we tried that? But the fact is, it was really in Sadat's brain. That was the stoppage. And as soon as that stoppage was cleared, the pipes flowed. And that's all I'm saying.
Also, what I'm saying is like a lot of if you see the BBC report about when they interviewed a lot of people in Palestine, Hamas, we see the torture that they do to their own Palestinian people. We see how, just like say a lot of the hostages are Palestinians. So there's a lot of people who can generally say they don't want peace in general. Now the one thing that I'm very worried about is like what happened now is going to create a lot of hatred. So this need to be, psychologically resolved somehow.
Again, there's a perfect example. Everybody worries about what happened. Everybody worries about that. That issue is a very important issue. You only hear it brought up vis-a-vis Israel's actions. I've not heard one person saying, well, if we're concerned about Palestinian peace, what happened here is really going to cause a lot of hatred from Israel. Nobody thinks that way. All these arguments, and they're true arguments, they only get used against Israel. If we're worried about creating hatred, who really crossed that line about creating generations of hatred? Hamas. And all the Arabs all over the world cheering for Hamas. Where is the reprimand of the Arab world saying, you should really worry about creating hatred? Nobody thinks that way because Israel, psychologically, is a compromised state. We're going to settle for you, but you don't have full rights. We don't worry about causing hate among Israelis because Israel is not real.
You're assuming, you're doing a lot of assumptions. It's not true. It's proportional too.
I've never heard anybody bring up the fact that Hamas and the Arab world should be concerned about creating hatred in Israelis. I've never heard anybody say that.
I think it's very legit point, but I think the proportion of how many people are including in losing people, like I said before, me personally, if I lose my brother, my mother, my sister, from both sides, what's going to happen?
These arguments started on October 8th. Come on.
It started way before that. It goes back and forth the whole time. So the next day, let's say it's peace now. What's going to happen in Israel, politics, in general? Who's going to take a charge? What do you think of,
I'm happy to answer, but I really do want to find out how one finds humor in this kind of stuff. So I need Lou to weigh in seriously on this because I'm not kidding. It's been miserable for months.
Well, I can tell you one thing. You guys start to copy us. We started the tunnel thing. Why'd you have to copy us?
No, really, anyway. Politics, look, immediately after October 7th, actually, even on October 7th, everyone, myself included, said Bibi is the next prime minister walking. There's no way he survives this because he's been in charge for 13 of the last 14 years. He was in charge the day of. Of course, he's not the only one who effed up. He's among the people who effed up. He's the only one who said he's not going to. He was not said he's going to take responsibility. It's very clear the heads of the military and intelligence, etc., are going to resign. They've basically hinted at that. They say after the war, I'm out of here. And Bibi is not. The thing is, Bibi's an amazing politician in the worst cynical way, and in theory, if nothing happens, there aren't elections this year. Elections are scheduled for like 3 years from now. So everyone is assuming in Israel probably elections happen in 2024, and the polls right now are quite clear that he would lose, and the winner would be Benny Gantz.
You think he's going to go left or right?
It would go left to the center, but not left. It would go to the center in the form of Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz would be the winner right now if the polls were correct. The clear winner. That doesn't mean the polls.
You think it was going to go left or right?
No, but let me just say
it can't go right. Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, it would go right in the sense that the Israeli public, from a security standpoint, like after any major attack or after the second Intifada, has gone far to the right. That people who used to be on the left or still are on the left are saying, "Ain't no way, we're not trusting them with a penknife." But in terms of the political map, it would move to Benny Gantz, and in some ways, that's not a major difference. I think a lot of students on campuses in America are not going to rejoice at Benny Gantz. But in terms of an interlocutor for the United States to work with, for the Saudis to work with, for anyone else, he's a very different character. He's very hard-nosed. He's a military chief, and he's part of the war cabinet right now. So he's not fundamentally different in some ways, but in terms of certainly, for example, relations with the Palestinian Authority, and thinking about how that could be introduced into Gaza, I think he'd be quite different from Netanyahu. He'd also have a coalition. It'd be complicated. That's one. Two, the truly despicable nut jobs that Bibi brought in to this coalition they'd be out. And that'd be huge. That'd be very important. It's not be enough. They're not the ones running the war, but a lot of the worst language you're hearing, a lot of the worst things, and very bad societal dynamics are also being fed by really some of the worst elements being brought into this coalition by Netanyahu, and that would change. But I'll just caveat again. Back in 2019, I wrote a piece saying the end is nigh for Netanyahu, and that's in the comedy section of things. He's way better
You
than
are
me.
funny.
No, yeah, right. He's way better than me in politics. He's smarter than me. It's like, and he has no shame. And
isn't it crazy that they still talking to Abbas? Like today, Blinken was like, "Hey, you have to step up." Seriously?
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's the other thing. So I agree. It'd have to be someone else than Bibi. It would need to be someone else than Abbas.
Exactly. Like all the players need to go.
Absolutely. I agree.
Why are they doing this? Why is Blinken, or like I almost feel like they wanted to have nothing.
No, I think for the Americans and for the Europeans and for many others, look, they view the PLO, not really the PA, they view the PLO as a legitimate interlocutor. And do they hope that there would be change? Yes. Are they also afraid of change? Sure, because who knows who comes after Abbas. But they also kind of feel that's a Palestinian issue. And we deal with the Palestinian, right? He's the Palestinian president, so we deal with him. That's kind of that's not only that.
I want to ask a contrarian.
I want comedy.
I want to ask a contrarian question about Netanyahu.
All right.
And I'll preface it with this. My own lifetime, as you see, presidents in the rearview mirror, the partisan battles and the accusations from party to party kind of fade away. Within the Trump era, when there's such divide, I've seen in my own country, everybody tries to blame everything on the other side. For instance, what always comes to mind is that they tried to blame Trump. As soon as COVID happened, they tried to blame Trump for the fact that the first batch of tests at the CDC failed. Kind of ridiculous stuff, which now here we are years later, nobody even remembers that. But at the time, that was a huge issue. All of which is to say that when I hear all the knocks on Netanyahu, I'm never quite sure how much of that is simply the reality of very, very acrimonious partisan politics, and how much of it is really to be laid at his feet. Because, and it's a long way of asking this question, I can't help noticing that there were Abraham Accords, and they were about to finalize a deal with Saudi Arabia. This was 100% Netanyahu's accomplishment. And by the way, John Kerry and many other experts told him, you're ridiculous. If you think you're ever going to make any peace deals with the Arabs that doesn't go through the Palestinian state, John Kerry goes, no. Remember that? Yeah. And this moron, Netanyahu, this horrible leader, was this close to rewriting the strategic map of the Middle East. And who knows what a sunny day would have happened. And so I get it. I understand why he's distasteful. I abhor the fact that Smotrich and Gavir. I'm with everybody on these criticisms, but there's always a part of me and say, yeah, but what about the accomplishments? They just pretend there are none, but I see them.
No, he's not. Well, first of all, he's not a moron. No one is accusing him of being a moron. He's very, very smart in good and bad ways. I think there are accomplishments, and I think the Abraham Accords are chief among them from the Israeli perspective, at least. But if Netanyahu has been prime minister for so many years in Israel. There are many different chapters. In the 1990s, he was prime minister the first time, very divisive, very young. He was 47. Then he comes back in 2009, and there's sort of the sensible adult phase of Netanyahu's leadership. He brings in moderate people to his cabinet, even Ehud Barak from the Labour Party, but many others, also Likud people, but the sensible, sort of level-headed, sort of small C conservative types. And that lasts kind of until about 2015, a bit more than that. He entered a very different phase. And so I hear what you're saying, and the Abraham Accords is true, but he did enormous damage in two different ways that is unforgivable and will be his legacy. One, while he was doing, I call this anti-solutionist kind of approach, like, well, we can't reach peace with Palestinians, we'll go for the Arab world, etc. In the meantime, the West Bank has become such a disaster for Palestinians, but also for Israelis. The reality of enmeshing into Israel, the sort of de facto annexation, all these are horrendous. And historically so, and contributed also to this. Second, the Gaza Strip, this strategy that allowed October 7th in the end to happen. It's not, people don't blame him just for, where was the intelligence on that day, which is obviously more the intelligence than him. It's the whole strategy of we'll live with Hamas. It also weakens the PA, great, and a completely wrong strategy. And the last thing, which is enormously important, Israel is before October 6th, Israel was so deeply divided upon itself, so acrimonious among Israelis, among Jewish Israelis too, about his attempt to gut the Israeli democratic system. And on there, the criticism, by the way, I think is completely correct.
Yeah.
I wrote about it before. I mean, I think it's, there's people who say, well, he was just trying to tinker. It's not true. What they were trying to push was enormously damaging. So his legacy, there's a tragic element to it because he's obviously brilliant in many ways. And he also had real successes, real achievements. That's true. But certainly after October 7th, but honestly before too, it was a legacy, a terrible legacy, terrible leader, I think, in my mind.
Yeah, I agree with you about what the court fiasco and the West Bank. I'm less convinced about this Hamas thing only because the little research I did, it seems that Lapid was engaged in the same policy.
Oh, he's not alone.
It's the natural thing. Like, this is what it looks like to get rid of Hamas. It's not very easy. So kind of buying them off and bribing them and letting them get, this is the natural kind of strategy to back into, I don't know. But yeah, for those other reasons, I think you're right.
Do you guys think that the election here, the election here, last question, in the United States going to affect, but it's going to affect it? Going to affect the situation in the Middle East? Like,
well, I'll tell you what I'm very worried about. I'm worried about Trump becoming president again, and for something going wrong between Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump in their marriage. Because if Jared were to get caught cheating or something, I'm afraid Trump could go all in against Israel. But it's, so long as Ivanka has a Jewish husband, I think Trump will be. That's my joke. Go ahead.
Well, guys, thank you so much. This was awesome, Natan.
Wait, he didn't answer. Natan didn't answer about the election, the American election.
I don't know because I don't know what Trump will do. No, it's so unpredictable. I think it would be extremely damaging because I think it would be enormously damaging for America and for the institutions here. I think it'd be completely different than it was before. So I'm very, very worried.
But would it affect the Middle East?
What do you think?
If Trump versus
it would affect the Middle East very much. I'm not completely sure in what way. You could expect more of the same. So probably be very pro-Saudi, pro-Israeli. But what exactly would that mean in this context?
Yeah, I think the answer is that if you think that the Israeli policies, uncompromised by whatever effect Biden is having on them, are the better policies, then if Trump is president, then you would think that would be an improvement because the Israel will have a freer hand. If you think the opposite, that thank God Joe Biden is kind of keeping Israel on a more even keel, then you're going to think that Trump is bad, right? That's Israel's going to have a freer hand.
Yeah.
Who knows? If we're all honest with ourselves,
Lou, what do you think?
Nobody knows.
Well, I think all the people who are claiming that they will not vote for Joe Biden because of his position on Israel are going to vote for Joe Biden. So I don't think Biden loses any of
because
those votes. I think people pay a lot of, they talk a lot of shit about, I'm going to go up against my party. And it's like, no, you're not. You're going to, no matter who's on the Republican side, they're going to vote against that. I mean,
if Biden loses, I predict it will be because of this kind of whistling while the border is non-existent. Did you heard that yesterday in New York, they're kicking kids out of school to deal with migrants?
Yeah.
It's metastasized. It's no longer just in red state America. It's coming to blue America now, and blue America's all of a sudden they're not calling it racist anymore to be complaining about the border. Now it's how dare they?
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much, Natan. Thank you so much for your time and for being here. We'd love to have you again. And if you ever come to New York, come visit us.
I invited him a million times. He doesn't want to come.
No, and I've tried. No, it's really, it's gonna happen.
Okay.
They're
Do you want
open
to
to
share where
in-person.
people can follow you or read your article, watch your shows?
Lou.
Oh, yeah, sorry. VLouPerez.com. And you can check out my book, That Joke Isn't Funny Anymore.
Natan, go ahead.
Brookings.edu and on Twitter and all the usual stuff at Natan Sachs. No H.
Brookings, and I'm gonna have the link there. Noam _Dworman at Twitter.
I wish you wouldn't encourage people to look at my Twitter feed, but okay.
I love your Twitter. And you love your Twitter too.
I'm just waiting to
annoys me sometimes, but it's fine. But it's you have some good argument. I enjoy it. Noam _Dworman. All right, guys. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Shalom.